There are nights that arrive like uninvited guests, settling into your life with a weight you don't recognize until years later. This was one of those nights, October, I think, though the exact date has blurred into something softer, more impressionistic. What I remember instead is the sound of rain against glass, steady and insistent, like fingers drumming against a door that no one wants to answer. I was 39 then, sitting in Damien's living room on a couch that had seen better decades. The fabric was worn thin in places where countless bodies had settled before us, and there was a coffee stain shaped like a continent I couldn't name. His television was paused on some movie we'd started but stopped watching. A frozen frame of two actors caught mid-conversation, their faces lit blue in the darkness. We'd been drinking, but not in the way you might imagine. No bottles scattered across the table, no slurred words or reckless laughter. Just 2 beers each, maybe 3. Enough to sand down the sharp edges of our usual careful politeness. Enough to make the silences between us feel less like empty space and more like something breathing. Damien sat beside me, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something earthier, cigarettes, maybe, or the faint mustiness of old books. He stared straight ahead at that frozen screen, but I could feel his attention like heat radiating from a fire. Not focused on me, exactly, but aware of me in a way that made my skin feel too tight. The rain had been falling for hours, turning the world outside into something liquid and uncertain. Every few minutes, a car would pass, its headlights sweeping across the walls like lighthouse beams, illuminating dust motes that danced and settled back into darkness. In those brief moments of light, I could see the cluttered geography of his life, stacks of photography books, empty picture frames leaning against the wall, a guitar with broken strings that he'd never gotten around to fixing. It was then, in that suspended quiet, that he spoke. His voice came out softer than I'd heard it in years, almost a whisper. He said he just wanted to feel something tonight. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, and I found myself holding my breath, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever fragile thing was taking shape in the darkness. He didn't cry. Damien was never one for easy displays of emotion, even as kids. But there was something raw in his stillness, something that made me think of bandages being slowly peeled away from a wound that hadn't quite healed. He sat there, hands resting on his knees, and for the first time all evening, he turned to look at me directly. His eyes in the blue light from the television were darker than I remembered, or maybe it was just the shadows. He asked if I would lay with him for a bit. Not lie down together, not come to bed, not any of the loaded phrases that might have made this moment something it wasn't ready to be. Just lay with him. Simple, innocent, devastating. My heart did something then that I can only describe as stumbling. Not racing, not pounding, just a missed beat, like a record skipping over a scratch. It wasn't because the request felt romantic or sexual, though those undercurrents were there, flowing beneath the surface like a river you can hear but not see. It was because I recognized something in his voice that I'd been carrying around inside myself for longer than I cared to admit. Something unnamed and unacknowledged, but no less real for its silence. I hesitated. Not for long. Maybe 3 seconds, maybe 5, but long enough to feel the weight of that pause settle between us like a stone dropped into still water. Long enough for me to wonder if he would notice, if he would read into it all the things I wasn't ready to say out loud. Long enough to feel like a betrayal of something I couldn't even name. Then I shifted, awkwardly at first, trying to figure out the mechanics of 2 grown men sharing a space meant for one. The couch protested under our weight, springs creaking like old bones, but we found a way to fit ourselves together without quite touching. Him on his back, staring up at the ceiling where shadows from the rain-streaked windows moved like living things. Me on my side, close enough to feel the rise and fall of his breathing, far enough away to maintain the illusion that this was just 2 old friends seeking comfort on a lonely night. But illusions are fragile things, and even as I closed my eyes and tried to convince myself that this was normal, that this was nothing, I could feel the current running between us. Not electricity exactly, but something quieter and more persistent. Like gravity, but warmer. Like recognition, but deeper. The storm outside had settled into a steady rhythm, and in that cocoon of sound and shadow, we lay there breathing the same air, sharing the same silence. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. But something had shifted, some invisible line had been crossed, and we both knew it even if we weren't ready to say so. In the years since, I've tried to pinpoint the exact moment when everything changed. Was it when he asked me to stay? When I said yes without words? Or was it something smaller, more subtle? The way he let his guard down just enough to show me the loneliness he'd been carrying, or the way I recognized it because it looked so much like my own? I don't have answers to those questions, not really. All I know is that we lay there in the blue-lit darkness, two men who had spent most of their lives learning how to want the right things, and for once, neither of us was trying very hard to pretend. But that night was still weeks away from happening when I tell this story properly. To understand how I ended up on Damien's couch, breathing the same careful air, you have to understand the life I was living before he came back. You have to understand the weight of ordinary days. I was 39 and had been married to Elaine for 16 years. She was the kind of woman who folded fitted sheets into perfect squares and remembered everyone's birthdays without writing them down. Practical in the way that keeps a household running, kind in the way that makes neighbors wave from their driveways. Our children, Miriam and Troy, were 13 and 9 respectively, old enough to have their own complicated inner lives, young enough to still need me to drive them places. We lived on Maple Street in a house painted the color of coffee with too much cream. Beige, I suppose, though Elaine preferred to call it warm neutral. The lawn was cut in diagonal stripes every Saturday, the kitchen counters wiped down each night before bed. There were family photos in matching frames arranged along the hallway, documenting birthdays and holidays and school plays with the determined cheerfulness of people who understood that happiness was something you built, brick by brick, through consistent effort. My days followed a rhythm that had calcified over the years into something resembling contentment. I woke at 6:15, made coffee in the same blue mug I'd used for a decade, and arrived at Riverside High School by 7:30. As a guidance counselor, I spent my days in a cramped office with motivational posters and college brochures, listening to 17-year-olds worry about their futures while I tried to remember what it felt like to have that kind of wide-open possibility ahead of me. The work wasn't unpleasant. I helped kids figure out which colleges might accept them, mediated disputes between teachers and parents, and occasionally talked someone through a crisis that felt earth-shattering until the next crisis arrived to replace it. There was something satisfying about creating order from chaos, about helping young people find their way through the maze of standardized tests and application deadlines that would supposedly determine the rest of their lives. During lunch duty, I patrolled the cafeteria with the weary vigilance of a mall security guard, breaking up arguments about nothing and confiscating phones that weren't supposed to be out during meals. The noise was constant. Hundreds of conversations layering over each other, the clatter of trays, the squeak of sneakers on linoleum. I'd learned to tune it out, to let it become background static while my mind wandered to grocery lists and weekend plans and the persistent drip in the upstairs bathroom that I kept meaning to fix. Evenings were homework supervision and dinner table conversations about Troy's soccer team and Miriam's drama club auditions. We attended church on Sundays because it was what people in our neighborhood did, sitting in the same pew week after week, while Reverend Martinez spoke about love and forgiveness and the importance of community. I sang along with hymns I'd known since childhood and shook hands during the passing of the peace, playing the role of devoted husband and father with a competence that had become second nature. But there were moments, standing in the shower while the water ran lukewarm, lying in bed listening to Elaine's steady breathing, driving the same route to work through streets I could navigate blindfolded, when I felt like I was watching my life happen to someone else. Not unhappy, exactly, but not entirely present either. Like I was performing a version of myself that everyone else seemed to find convincing, including me most of the time. It was in the grocery store on a Tuesday evening in late September that everything shifted sideways. I was working my way through Elaine's carefully organized list, checking off items with the methodical precision of someone who had learned that efficiency was its own form of peace when I saw him. Damien stood in the produce section, examining tomatoes with the intense focus of someone who had nowhere else to be. He wore boots caked with dried mud and a jacket that looked like it had seen several seasons of hard weather. His hair was longer than I remembered, pulled back in a way that made the sharp angles of his face more pronounced. He looked like he'd stepped out of one of those black and white photographs he used to take in high school, all contrast and shadow and interesting light. 15 years. That's how long it had been since we'd shared the same space, breathed the same air. 15 years since graduation, since the inevitable drift that happens when childhood friends discover they're becoming different kinds of adults. I'd heard through the gossip network that keeps small towns informed about their prodigal children that he'd been living in Portland, then San Francisco, then somewhere in Colorado. Always moving, always chasing something just beyond the horizon. I could have walked past. Should have, probably. My cart was half full, my list was only half checked, and Elaine would be wondering where I was if I took too long. But something in his posture, the way he held himself like he was braced against wind that no one else could feel, made me stop. I said his name, and when he turned, his face went through a series of micro-expressions too quick to catalog. Surprise, recognition, something that might have been pleasure, and underneath it all, a guardedness that hadn't been there when we were 17 and thought we understood how the world worked. He smiled, but it was the careful smile of someone who had learned to be wary of unexpected encounters. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, standing there between the organic lettuce and the discount apples, catching up in the shorthand way that old friends do. He told me he was back in town taking care of his father, who'd had a stroke 6 months earlier. I told him about my job, my family, the basic architecture of a life built for stability rather than adventure. What I didn't tell him was how strange it felt to hear my own voice describing that life to someone who had known me before I became it. How the words sounded hollow in a way they never did when I was talking to neighbors or colleagues or parents at school events. How his presence seemed to cast everything I'd built into a different kind of light, neither better nor worse, just different. We exchanged phone numbers with the casual promise to get coffee sometime. The kind of vague commitment that usually dissolves into good intentions and busy schedules. But as I watched him walk toward the checkout line, something had already begun to shift inside me. Not dramatically, not in any way I could name at the time. Just a subtle recalibration, like a compass needle finding true north after years of pointing somewhere close enough. 3 days after our grocery store encounter, Damien called. Not texted, which would have been easier to ignore, but called while I was grading college recommendation letters at the kitchen table. Elaine was upstairs helping Miriam with algebra, and Troy was in the living room building something elaborate with Legos, the sound of plastic clicking against plastic providing a steady rhythm to the evening. He asked if I wanted to come over Friday night. Nothing formal, he said, just a few people around a fire pit in his backyard. His voice carried that same careful casualness I remembered from high school, when he'd invite me to things that felt bigger than they were supposed to be. I told him I'd think about it, which was a lie. I'd already decided yes before he finished asking. Friday came wrapped in the kind of October evening that made you remember why people wrote poems about autumn. The air was crisp enough to justify a jacket, but warm enough to sit outside without shivering. I stopped at the convenience store on the way over and bought a 6-pack of beer, something domestic and unremarkable, the kind of contribution that wouldn't draw attention to itself. Damien's father's house sat on a street I used to bike down as a kid, though it looked smaller now than it had in memory. The backyard was exactly as he described it. Mismatched lawn chairs arranged in a rough circle around a metal fire pit, blankets draped over the backs of chairs like colorful bandages. Maybe 8 people were already there, most of them faces I recognized from high school, but hadn't spoken to in years. I stayed for exactly 1 hour and 47 minutes. Long enough to be polite, short enough to avoid any meaningful conversation. I drank 1 beer, listened to stories about people I barely remembered, and made the appropriate sounds of recognition when someone brought up a shared memory that felt like it belonged to someone else's life. But I watched Damien. The way he moved between conversations like he was conducting an orchestra only he could hear. The way he laughed, not often, but with his whole body when something genuinely amused him. The way he looked at me across the fire when he thought I wasn't paying attention, his expression unreadable in the dancing light. When I left, he walked me to my car. He didn't ask why I was leaving early or suggest that I stay longer. He just thanked me for coming, his hand briefly touching my shoulder in a gesture that felt both casual and deliberate. I drove home with my windows down, letting the cool air wash away the smell of wood smoke that had settled into my clothes. But the next Friday, I went back. This time there were fewer people, maybe 5 including us. The conversation was quieter, more thoughtful. Someone brought a guitar, but didn't play it, just held it across their lap like a talisman. We talked about movies we'd seen recently, books we'd meant to read, the way the town had changed since we were kids. Nothing consequential, nothing that would matter if you tried to repeat it the next day. But the silences between topics felt different than they had the week before. Less empty, more expectant. The third Friday, it was just the 2 of us. I arrived to find him alone in the backyard, feeding small branches to a fire that had been burning for hours. The other chairs were folded and stacked against the house, but 2 remained in their circle of light. He handed me a beer without asking if I wanted one, and we settled into those chairs like we'd been doing this for years. That's when he started showing me his photographs. He kept them in a wooden box that looked like it had survived several moves, the corners worn smooth from handling. Not prints you'd frame or put in an album, but the kind of images that existed for their own sake. Abandoned buildings with vines growing through broken windows. Motion blur studies of people walking through rain. A series of close-ups showing rust patterns on old machinery, each one composed like an abstract painting. His work had a quality I couldn't name at first, something that went beyond technical skill. It was the way he saw decay not as ending, but as transformation. The way he found beauty in things that were falling apart. Each image felt like a secret he was sharing, a way of seeing the world that most people either couldn't or wouldn't access. He talked about light and shadow and the decisive moment, photography terms I half remembered from an art class I'd taken in college. But what stayed with me wasn't the technical discussion. It was the way his voice changed when he talked about his work, becoming more animated and certain than I'd heard it in our casual conversations. This was who he was when he wasn't performing the role of small-town returee, making polite conversation with old friends. It was during our 4th evening together that he showed me the photograph that changed everything. 2 boys on a rusted swing set, maybe 16 years old, sitting side by side but not touching. One was looking straight ahead at something beyond the frame. The other was turned slightly, his gaze focused entirely on his companion. The late afternoon light caught them from behind, creating silhouettes that were both specific and universal. You could see the tension in their postures, the careful distance they maintained even as they chose to sit close enough to share the same patch of shade. I recognized us immediately, though I had no memory of the moment being captured. We must have been at the old playground behind the elementary school, the one they tore down when they built the new housing development. I stared at the photograph longer than I should have, trying to reconcile the boy in the image with my memories of that time in my life. He told me he'd taken it when we were 16, his voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Said he didn't think I'd ever known he was taking pictures. The way he said it made it clear that this wasn't just documentation of a random afternoon. This was evidence of something that had been there all along, something I'd either missed or chosen not to see. I handed the photograph back without saying anything, but my silence felt like a conversation we were having in a language neither of us had learned to speak out loud yet. After that evening, something shifted in the rhythm of our interactions. Damien started appearing at school during my free periods, showing up at my office door with coffee and the casual excuse of being in the neighborhood. The first time it happened, I was genuinely surprised. The second time, I found myself checking the clock around the time he usually arrived. By the 4th visit, I was lying to my colleagues about where I was going when I left for lunch. It wasn't that our conversations were inappropriate or that anyone would have found them suspicious. He'd ask about my work, I'd ask about his father's recovery. We'd talk about the weather, local politics, the way downtown was slowly filling with artisanal coffee shops and boutiques selling things no one really needed. Normal topics, normal tone, normal duration. But there was an undercurrent running beneath those surface conversations, something that made me hyper-aware of who might be watching, who might wonder why my old high school friend had suddenly become such a regular presence in my carefully ordered days. I started closing my office door when he visited, telling myself it was to avoid disturbing the secretary who sat just outside. I began timing our conversations, making sure he left before the bell rang and students filled the hallways. Most telling of all, I stopped mentioning his visits to Elaine. Not because she would have been jealous or suspicious, but because something about those conversations felt like they belonged to a part of my life that existed separately from my marriage, my family, my role as the reliable guidance counselor who always knew exactly what advice to give. The lies started small. White lies, justifiable lies, the kind that married people tell each other every day to preserve the smooth functioning of shared life. When Elaine asked how my day had been, I'd mentioned the difficult student who needed college guidance and the faculty meeting that ran long, but I'd leave out the 20 minutes Damien and I spent talking about the way afternoon light fell through my office window. When she wondered aloud why I seemed more cheerful lately, I'd credit the changing season or a good night's sleep, not the anticipation I felt every Tuesday and Thursday around 11:30, watching the hallway for his familiar silhouette. But even small lies accumulate weight over time, and I began to feel the burden of all the things I wasn't saying, not just to Elaine, but to myself. Because something was happening between Damien and me that I didn't have words for yet, something that existed in the spaces between our conversations and the moments when our eyes met across a room full of other people. The air between us had thickened into something almost tangible, not sexual tension exactly, though that was certainly present, humming beneath the surface like electrical current through water. It was more like recognition, the slow dawning awareness that we were circling around something that had been there all along, waiting for us to be brave enough or foolish enough to acknowledge it. There was no declaration, no dramatic shift that I could point to later and say that was when everything changed. Instead, it was an erosion so gradual that I barely noticed it happening until I found myself standing in completely different territory than where I'd started. It began with walks. I'd always been someone who needed movement to think clearly, but that fall I started taking longer routes home from work, meandering through neighborhoods I hadn't explored in years. I told myself it was about exercise, about taking advantage of the crisp October evenings before winter arrived to trap us all indoors. But the truth was more complicated. The truth was that walking had become a way of processing the confusion that seemed to follow me everywhere, a rhythm that helped me sort through thoughts I wasn't ready to examine too closely. It was during one of these walks that Damien appeared beside me, as if materialized from shadow and evening air. I was heading down Elm Street, past the houses where we'd trick-or-treated as kids, when I heard footsteps matching my pace. I turned to find him there, hands in his jacket pockets, breath visible in small clouds that dissipated as quickly as they formed. He asked if he could join me, and I nodded because speaking felt too complicated. We walked in silence for several blocks, our footsteps creating a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. The streetlights cast long shadows that stretched and shortened as we moved, and I found myself watching the way our silhouettes occasionally overlapped before separating again. That first walk lasted maybe 30 minutes. We talked about nothing consequential. The weather, the way the trees were turning, a story he'd heard about the old movie theater downtown possibly reopening. But there was something different about conversation while moving, something that made words feel less weighted, more honest. Maybe it was not having to look directly at each other, or maybe it was the steady rhythm of walking that somehow synchronized our thoughts as well as our steps. The next evening, I found myself taking the same route, and again he appeared. This time we talked about work, his photography projects and my students, the mundane frustrations and small victories that filled our days. But even ordinary topics felt different when discussed while walking through gathering darkness, as if the movement and the evening air stripped away some of the politeness that usually governed our interactions. By the third walk, we'd established an unspoken routine. I'd leave my house around 7, and somewhere along Elm Street, he'd fall into step beside me. We never planned it, never discussed it, but it happened with the regularity of something natural and inevitable. It was during our fifth walk together that the conversation shifted into deeper territory. We were heading through the old section of town, past houses that had been built in the 30s and still showed signs of their original grandeur despite decades of benign neglect. The streetlights were more widely spaced here, creating pools of yellow light separated by stretches of comfortable darkness. It was in one of these darker intervals that Damien began talking about fear. Not the obvious fears, not the things that wake you up at 3 in the morning wondering if you remembered to lock the door or turn off the stove. He talked about the fear of living the wrong life, of waking up at 50 and realizing you'd spent decades being someone you never intended to become. The fear of wanting things you weren't supposed to want, of being fundamentally different from everyone around you in ways that felt both essential and impossible to explain. His voice carried a weight I hadn't heard before, a vulnerability that made me understand that this wasn't casual conversation. This was confession, the kind of truth-telling that happens when darkness and movement combine to create a temporary sanctuary from the ordinary world. I found myself responding in kind, admitting things I'd never said out loud. The numbness I sometimes felt going through the motions of my carefully constructed life. The way I could stand in a room full of people who knew me well and still feel completely alone. The strange ache of living someone else's dream, of being good at playing a role that had somehow become indistinguishable from who I actually was. We talked about the weight of expectations, both the ones imposed by others and the ones we imposed on ourselves. About the way small compromises accumulate over time until you find yourself in a life that looks right from the outside but feels hollow at its core. About the terror of change and the equal terror of staying exactly where you are. It was during one of these conversations, maybe 2 weeks into our walking routine, that Damien stopped suddenly in the middle of the sidewalk. We were under a broken streetlight, surrounded by the kind of darkness that makes confession easier. He turned to face me, and even though I couldn't see his expression clearly, I could feel the intensity of his attention. He said he used to think he was broken because he couldn't want what everyone else wanted, couldn't feel the things he was supposed to feel or desire the life that everyone assumed he should desire. He talked about the years he'd spent trying to fix himself, trying to become someone who could fit comfortably into the world as it was presented to him. The words hung in the air between us like smoke, and I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition so profound it was almost physical. But I didn't respond. Couldn't respond. The truth he'd shared was too close to truths I'd been avoiding in myself, too dangerous to acknowledge out loud. Instead, I started walking again, and after a moment, he fell back into step beside me. We finished that walk in silence, but his words followed me home and stayed with me for days afterward. I found myself thinking about them while I graded papers, while I listened to students talk about their college dreams, while I sat at the dinner table with my family discussing weekend plans and grocery lists. At home, the weight of these unspoken realizations began to show in ways I couldn't entirely control. Elaine noticed first, the way partners do when the familiar rhythms of shared life begin to shift. She mentioned that I seemed distracted lately, quieter than usual. She asked if everything was okay at work, if there was something bothering me that I wanted to talk about. I gave reassuring answers, blamed stress and busy schedules and the approaching end of the semester. But the truth was harder to hide than I'd expected. I found myself going through the motions of my marriage with a kind of detached awareness that felt almost like watching someone else's life. When Elaine reached for me in bed, I responded, but without the presence I'd once brought to those moments. When she talked about vacation plans or home improvement projects, I participated in the conversation but felt like I was speaking lines from a script I no longer fully believed in. The change was subtle enough that I thought I was managing it, maintaining the facade of normalcy while I figured out what was happening inside me. But one evening in early November, as I was loading the dishwasher after dinner, Elaine asked the question I'd been dreading. She asked if there was someone else. She didn't ask it with accusation or anger, but with the careful tone of someone who'd been observing evidence, and had reached an uncomfortable conclusion. She stood in the kitchen doorway watching me arrange plates with more precision than the task required, and I could feel her attention like weight on my shoulders. I said no too quickly, with too much emphasis, the kind of denial that reveals exactly what it's trying to hide. The word came out sharp and defensive, and we both heard what it really meant. We both understood that my reaction was the answer she'd been afraid to hear. She didn't push, didn't ask follow-up questions, or demand explanations. She just nodded slowly and said she was going to check on the kids' homework, leaving me alone with the dishes and the knowledge that my careful deception had cracked open just enough to let the truth show through. That night, after Elaine had fallen asleep, I lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about the conversation with a mixture of guilt and relief. Guilt because I was lying to someone who deserved better, who had built her life around the assumption that I was someone I was no longer sure I'd ever actually been. Relief because keeping the secret had been exhausting in ways I was only beginning to understand. The next evening, instead of taking my usual walk, I found myself driving to Damien's house. I didn't call first, didn't plan what I was going to say. I just got in my car after dinner and drove through the familiar streets until I was sitting in his driveway, engine off, trying to understand what I was doing there. He answered the door like he'd been expecting me, though we'd made no plans to see each other. Maybe something in my face told him this wasn't a casual visit, because he stepped aside without questions and led me into the living room where soft music was playing from speakers I couldn't see. We sat on his couch, the same one where we'd eventually share that moment of desperate honesty weeks later. But this evening felt different. Less urgent, more inevitable. Like we were finally allowing ourselves to acknowledge what had been building between us all these weeks of walking and talking and careful not touching. The music was something instrumental and melancholy, the kind of sound that creates its own atmosphere. We talked quietly about nothing important, his father's slow recovery, my concerns about a student who was struggling with college applications. But underneath the ordinary conversation, something else was happening. Some final barrier was dissolving, some last pretense falling away. It happened without announcement or intention. We were sitting close enough that I could smell his cologne and the faint scent of the cigarette he'd probably had before I arrived. Close enough that when he shifted slightly, settling back against the couch cushions, his shoulder pressed against mine. The contact was brief, could have been accidental, could have been explained away as the inevitable result of two people sharing a space designed for one and a half. But he didn't move away, and neither did I. We sat there like that, shoulder to shoulder, letting the music fill the spaces between our careful breathing. No kiss, no dramatic declaration, no crossing of the bright lines that would have made this moment something we couldn't take back. Just gravity, pulling us together in increments so small they might have been imperceptible to anyone watching, but felt enormous to me. In that moment, with Damien's warmth seeping through the fabric of our clothes and his breathing matching the rhythm of mine, I understood that whatever was happening between us had moved beyond friendship, beyond nostalgia, beyond any of the safe explanations I'd been using to justify the changes in my behavior. This was something else entirely. Something that would require a kind of honesty I wasn't sure I was capable of, and decisions I wasn't ready to make. But for that evening, sitting in the soft light of his living room with music creating a cocoon around us, I let myself exist in the space between what was and what might be, feeling for the first time in years like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. It was a photograph that finally broke the surface of all the things we'd been carefully not saying. 2 weeks after that evening on his couch, after we'd settled into a rhythm of almost touching that felt both sustainable and impossible, Damien called and asked if I could stop by after work. There was something in his voice, not urgency exactly, but a weight that made me understand this wasn't about our usual careful conversations over coffee or beer. I found him sitting on his front porch despite the November chill, wearing the same weather jacket he'd had on that first night at the grocery store. He was holding a manila envelope, turning it over in his hands like he was trying to decide whether to give it to me or burn it instead. He handed me the envelope without explanation, Just watched my face as I opened it with the kind of careful attention people usually reserve for medical test results or legal documents. Inside was a single photograph, black and white, printed on the kind of paper that gave it weight and permanence. It was us, from maybe 3 weeks earlier, sitting on this same porch during one of my evening visits. We weren't looking at each other in the image, weren't even obviously together in any conventional sense. But our bodies were angled toward each other in a way that created its own gravitational field, leaning in the same direction like plants reaching for the same source of light. Our silhouettes almost touching, separated by maybe 6 inches that might as well have been a mile or a breath, depending on how you chose to see it. I stared at the photograph longer than I should have, trying to reconcile the 2 men in the image with my memory of that evening. In my mind, we'd been careful, appropriate, maintaining the boundaries that let me tell myself we were just old friends catching up. But the camera had captured something my conscious mind had been working hard to ignore. It had seen the tension, the pull, the way we inhabited space like 2 people who were trying very hard not to fall into each other's orbit. He said it felt like something. His voice was barely above a whisper, like he was afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile truth the photograph had made visible. I handed it back to him, but he shook his head and told me to keep it. There was something in his expression that made me understand this wasn't just documentation. This was evidence, proof of something that existed whether we acknowledged it or not. We sat there in the growing dusk, and I could feel him gathering courage for something that was going to change everything between us. I wanted to leave before he could say it, wanted to preserve the careful balance we'd maintained for weeks, but I also needed to hear whatever words were building in the silence. When he finally spoke, it wasn't with the certainty I'd expected. His voice carried the weight of someone who'd been carrying a secret for so long that speaking it aloud felt like surgery without anesthesia. He said he thought he'd been in love with me since we were 16. Not that he loved me now, not that he wanted to pursue something, but that he'd been carrying this feeling for more than 20 years, watching me build a life with someone else while he tried to convince himself that what he felt was friendship or nostalgia or anything other than what it actually was. The words hung in the cold air between us like smoke, visible and dissipating at the same time. I felt them settle into my chest, heavy and warm and terrifying, because they named something I'd been feeling but hadn't had the courage to recognize. I didn't know what to say, couldn't find words that felt adequate to the magnitude of what he'd just shared. So I did what felt safest in that moment. I left. I mumbled something about needing to get home, about Elaine expecting me for dinner, about responsibilities and schedules, and all the ordinary architecture of the life I'd built that suddenly felt like a prison of my own construction. I walked to my car with the photograph clutched in my hand, not trusting myself to look back at him sitting on that porch. The drive home passed in a blur of familiar streets that seemed suddenly foreign, like I was seeing them for the first time or the last time. I parked in my driveway and sat there for several minutes, staring at the warm yellow lights spilling from my kitchen windows, trying to understand how everything could look exactly the same when something fundamental had shifted. For the next several days, I moved through my life like someone recovering from a concussion. Everything felt slightly off, colors too bright or too dim, sounds coming from the wrong direction. I went to work, attended faculty meetings, helped students with their college applications, came home to dinner with my family. But it all felt like performance art, like I was playing the role of myself while the real me was somewhere else entirely. I found myself studying my reflection in bathroom mirrors, in car windows, in the black screen of my computer when it went to sleep, looking for some visible sign of the revelation that had exploded quietly in my chest. But I looked the same as always, maybe a little tired, maybe slightly distracted, but nothing that would make a stranger think this person's entire understanding of himself had been fundamentally altered. At night, lying beside Elaine while she slept, I would replay Damien's words in my head, turning them over like stones I'd found on a beach, examining them from every angle. The way he'd said 16, like he could pinpoint the exact moment when friendship had shifted into something else. The way he'd used the word love without qualification or explanation, as if it were simply a fact that had always existed, like gravity or the speed of light. I thought about that boy in the photograph he'd shown me weeks earlier, the one staring at his friend on the swing set. I tried to remember what I'd been feeling during those long afternoons we'd spent together, whether there had been moments when what I felt for him crossed the boundary from friendship into something I didn't have words for. The memories were elusive, shaped by years of careful reinterpretation and the natural tendency to edit our past selves into forms we could live with. But late at night, in the honesty that darkness sometimes provides, I could catch glimpses of what might have been true even then. The way I'd felt when he moved away for college, like something essential had been torn out of my chest. The way I'd thought about him during my first years with Elaine, wondering where he was and what kind of life he was building. The way his return had felt like the restoration of something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. It was on a Thursday night, maybe a week after his confession, that I found myself standing in my bathroom at 2 in the morning, staring at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. The house was quiet around me, filled with the steady breathing of people who belonged to me and to whom I belonged, at least on paper. I looked at the man in the mirror, 39 years old, graying at the temples, wearing the kind of practical pajamas that married fathers wear, and I tried to imagine telling him the truth I'd been avoiding. Tried to imagine what it would sound like to say out loud what Damien's confession had made me realize about myself. The words came out as barely a whisper, so quiet they might have been breath shaped into syllables. I think I loved him too. Past tense, because it felt safer that way, less like a betrayal of everything I'd built my life around. But even as I said it, I knew that past tense was a lie. I knew that what I felt for Damien existed in present tense, in future tense, in all the complicated tenses that encompass want and fear and recognition. Saying it aloud, even to my own reflection, even in a whisper that barely disturbed the air, felt like both wound and release. Like lancing something that had been infected for years, painful but necessary. Like finally exhaling after holding my breath for longer than I'd realized. I stood there for a long time after that, studying the face of someone who had just admitted something that would require everything in his life to change. Someone who could no longer pretend that the careful distance he'd maintained from his own desires was sustainable or honest. The man in the mirror looked the same as always, but I knew that something irreversible had happened. Some line had been crossed that couldn't be uncrossed. The truth, once spoken, had a way of demanding action, of making the status quo feel like complicity in its own denial. I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn, listening to Elaine's steady breathing and trying to understand what it meant to love two people in completely different ways, to be grateful for the life you'd built while simultaneously mourning the life you'd never allowed yourself to want. It was inevitable that Elaine would find the photograph. I knew this on some level. The way you know that leaving something fragile on the edge of a table means it will eventually fall. But knowing something intellectually and experiencing it emotionally are different kinds of preparation, and when the moment came, I felt as unprepared as if it had happened without warning. I'd kept the photograph in my briefcase, tucked between student files and college brochures where it seemed safely hidden among the ordinary paperwork of my professional life. But briefcases get reorganized, papers get shuffled, and on a Saturday morning in late November, while I was outside raking leaves with Troy, Elaine was looking for my insurance card to take Miriam to urgent care for what turned out to be strep throat. When I came inside an hour later, boots muddy and jacket smelling like autumn air, I found her sitting on the edge of our bed. The photograph was in her hands, and she was studying it with the kind of focused attention she usually reserved for important documents or concerning medical symptoms. She didn't look up when I entered the room, didn't acknowledge my presence with words or movement. She just continued staring at the image, and I watched her face as she took in what the camera had captured. The way Damien and I leaned toward each other like compass needles finding magnetic north, the unmistakable intimacy of two people existing in their own gravitational field. When she finally spoke, her voice was quieter than I'd expected, almost conversational. She asked if this was who I was. Not what I was doing, not whether I was having an affair, but whether this photograph showed her something essential about my identity that she'd never seen before. The question hit me like cold water, not because it was accusatory, but because it was the first time anyone had ever asked me to acknowledge myself that directly. For weeks, I'd been circling around the truth, approaching it from angles that felt safer, using words like confused and conflicted and going through a difficult time. But Elaine's question cut through all of that careful language and asked me to be honest about who I was at my core. I started to cry then, but not from guilt or shame or fear of consequences. I wept because someone had finally asked the question I'd been afraid to ask myself, and because I realized I'd been waiting my entire adult life for someone to give me permission to be truthful about the answer. She set the photograph on the nightstand and moved closer to me, not with the anger I might have expected, but with the kind of careful attention she'd always brought to moments of crisis. She was devastated. I could see it in the way her shoulders held themselves, in the slight tremor in her hands. But she was also determined to understand what was happening to our life together. We talked all night, not arguing, not accusing, but having the kind of conversation that happens when two people realize they're standing at the edge of something that will change everything, and they want to be careful about how they step forward. She asked if this was just loneliness, just a midlife crisis that would pass if we worked harder at our marriage, went to counseling, took that vacation we'd been talking about for years. Her voice when she asked this carried a kind of desperate hope, like she was offering me a lifeline back to the life we'd built together. I wanted to say yes. Wanted to tell her that what I felt for Damien was temporary confusion, a symptom of dissatisfaction that could be fixed with effort and commitment and time. But when I opened my mouth to give her that reassurance, nothing came out except more honesty than I'd planned to share. I told her it felt deeper than loneliness, older than dissatisfaction. I told her about the 16-year-old version of myself who had felt something for Damien that I'd spent decades trying to rationalize away. I told her about the way his return had awakened parts of me that I'd thought were safely buried beneath years of good behavior and appropriate choices. My voice betrayed me as I spoke, carrying a certainty I hadn't intended to reveal. Even as I tried to frame this as confusion or temporary crisis, the tone of my words made it clear that what I felt for Damien wasn't something I could simply decide not to feel. Elaine listened without interrupting, and when I finished talking, she was quiet for a long time. We sat there on our bed surrounded by the familiar architecture of our shared life. Wedding photos on the dresser, books we'd both read stacked on nightstands, clothes we'd bought together hanging in the closet, and tried to understand what it meant for one person in a marriage to discover they might be fundamentally different than both partners had assumed. Finally, she asked if I loved him. Present tense. No qualifications or conditions, just the simple question that contained everything else within it. I said yes, quietly, like admitting something to myself as much as to her. But yes. She nodded, not with acceptance exactly, but with the kind of recognition that comes when scattered pieces of evidence finally form a coherent picture. She said she'd wondered, these past few months, if something like this was happening. Not because she'd suspected an affair, but because I'd seemed like I was living slightly outside my own life, going through the motions of being myself without fully inhabiting the role. The conversation continued until dawn, covering territory that neither of us had ever expected to explore. We talked about love in its different forms, about the way people can build good lives with someone they care for deeply while still feeling like something essential is missing. We talked about authenticity and compromise, about the difference between being happy and being content, about what we owed to each other and to our children and to ourselves. She cried, but not in the way I'd feared. Not with anger or betrayal, but with the kind of grief that comes when something you've invested years of your life in reveals itself to be fundamentally different than you'd understood it to be. As the sun came up, she asked what I wanted to do. Not what I thought we should do, not what would be best for everyone involved, but what I actually wanted. It was another question no one had ever asked me so directly. I told her I didn't know, which was true, but also incomplete. What I knew but couldn't quite say was that I couldn't continue living in the space between honesty and performance, Couldn't keep pretending that the careful distance I'd maintained from my own desires was sustainable. That afternoon, while Elaine took the kids to her mother's house to give us both space to think, I drove to the old railroad bridge on the outskirts of town. It was a place Damien and I had biked to countless times as teenagers, a rusted steel structure that crossed a creek we'd spent summer afternoons exploring. I hadn't been there in years, but my body remembered the way without conscious direction. I found him already there, sitting on the concrete abutment with his legs dangling over the edge. He looked up when he heard my car, but didn't seem surprised to see me. Maybe he'd been expecting this conversation, or maybe he just understood that revelations like the one he'd shared required some kind of response, eventually. I told him I couldn't stay in between anymore. Couldn't keep living in the careful space we'd created where everything was possible and nothing was acknowledged. I needed time, I said. Space to figure out what it meant to be honest about who I was without immediately jumping from one kind of life to another. But I also told him he hadn't been wrong. About 16, about the way I'd felt even when I couldn't name it. About the connection that had been there all along, waiting for us to be brave enough or desperate enough to recognize it. He listened without trying to convince me to stay or leave, without pushing for promises or timelines or definitions. He just nodded and said he understood, and that he'd be there when I figured out what came next. The next week, I moved into a small apartment across town. Nothing fancy, just a one-bedroom place with hardwood floors that creaked and windows that let in good light. It came furnished with the kind of anonymous furniture that belonged to no one in particular, which felt appropriate for someone who was trying to figure out who he was without the context of the life he'd spent decades building. Miriam and Troy visited on weekends, bringing homework and soccer equipment and the easy chaos that children carry with them wherever they go. They seemed to accept the new arrangement with the resilience that kids often show in the face of adult complications, asking practical questions about where their things would go and whether they could paint their temporary bedrooms without getting too caught up in the emotional implications of their parents living separately. Elaine and I began the slow, careful process of untangling our lives without hatred. We met for coffee to discuss logistics and schedules, talked on the phone about parent-teacher conferences and permission slips, and all the ordinary business of raising children. There was sadness in these interactions, and a kind of awkward politeness that felt strange after 16 years of marriage. But there was also a relief that neither of us had expected. We were both grieving, but we were also both being more honest than we'd been in years. Maybe than we'd ever been. I didn't run to Damien. That would have been easier in some ways, would have provided a clear narrative arc from old life to new life, from confusion to resolution. But I wasn't ready for that kind of clarity. What I discovered about myself felt too important to rush into without understanding it fully, too significant to use as a simple bridge from one relationship to another. Instead, I learned to live alone for the first time in my adult life. Learned to cook meals for one person, to make decisions about how to spend evenings without consulting anyone else's preferences, to exist in space that reflected only my own choices and needs. It was harder than I'd expected and easier than I'd feared. Lonely sometimes, but also peaceful in ways that surprised me. For the first time in decades, I wasn't performing the role of husband or father or guidance counselor who had it all figured out. I was just myself, figuring out what that meant without the context of other people's expectations. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand that this wasn't just about Damien or about being attracted to men or about any single aspect of identity. This was about the difference between living a life that looked right from the outside and living a life that felt true from within. This was about learning to be honest about who I was, even when that honesty required everything to change. 3 months later, I sat on the hardwood floor of my apartment, surrounded by boxes that still held pieces of the life I'd left behind. The late afternoon lights slanted through windows I'd learned to love, casting everything in shades of gold and amber that made even the mundane seem significant. I'd been going through things slowly, deciding what belonged in this new version of my life and what could be released to the past. Most of it had been straightforward, clothes that still fit, books I might read again. a few photographs that didn't hurt to look at. But today I'd found something that stopped me entirely. An old yearbook from senior year, buried beneath tax documents and school papers. I couldn't remember packing it, couldn't imagine why I'd thought it would be important to bring. But there it was, bound in that particular shade of blue that every high school seems to choose for official publications, filled with faces that belonged to people I'd been, but no longer was. I flipped through pages of posed senior portraits and candid shots from football games and dances, looking for some version of myself that might explain how I'd ended up here. And then, tucked between pages devoted to the drama club and student government, I found something I'd never seen before. A note, written in Damien's careful handwriting across the margin of a page showing the photography club. The ink had faded, but the words were still legible. Thanks for being the only person who ever made me feel like I wasn't invisible. D. I stared at those words for a long time, trying to understand how I'd missed them for more than 20 years. Had I simply never looked at this page carefully enough? Had teenage me been too focused on other things to notice this small declaration hidden among the official record of our shared adolescence? The note felt like a message sent across decades, a younger version of Damien reaching forward through time to remind me that what we'd discovered between us wasn't new, wasn't sudden, wasn't a mistake born of loneliness or midlife confusion. It had been there all along, patient and persistent, waiting for us to become brave enough to see it. I was still sitting there with the yearbook in my lap when I heard a knock at the door. I knew it was him before I opened it, the way you sometimes know things that haven't been confirmed yet. He stood in the hallway holding 2 paper bags of groceries, looking uncertain in a way that reminded me of the 16-year-old boy who'd left that note in my yearbook. He asked if he could come in, and I stepped aside to let him pass. He moved through my apartment like he'd been there before, though this was his first visit, setting the bags on my kitchen counter and beginning to unpack them without explanation or permission. Bread, cheese, wine, fruit. The kinds of things people buy when they want to share a meal but aren't sure they'll be invited to stay. I watched him arrange everything on the counter with careful attention, and I understood that this wasn't just about groceries. This was an offering, a way of saying that he was ready to exist in my new life however I needed him to. We prepared food together in the kind of comfortable silence that usually takes years to develop. He sliced cheese while I opened wine, and we moved around each other in my small kitchen like we'd been doing this for decades instead of minutes. The ease of it surprised me, how natural it felt to share space with him, how right it seemed to have him in this place I'd been learning to call home. Later, we sat across from each other at my small table, close enough that our knees almost touched when we leaned forward. The space between us felt different than it had in all those careful months of walking and talking and not quite touching. The fear was gone, or at least transformed into something more manageable. What remained was possibility, pure and uncomplicated by the weight of secrets we'd been carrying. We talked about small things, his father's continued recovery, my adjustment to living alone, the way spring was beginning to show itself despite the lingering winter cold. But underneath the ordinary conversation, something else was happening. Some final barrier was dissolving, some last pretense falling away. He didn't ask me what came next, didn't push for promises or definitions or timelines. He seemed to understand that this moment was enough, that after years of living in the space between honesty and performance, simply being able to sit together without fear was its own kind of revolution. As the evening light faded and the apartment filled with the soft darkness that comes before you think to turn on lamps, I found myself looking at this man who had been my friend, my secret, my catalyst for discovering who I actually was beneath all the roles I'd learned to play so well. There was no kiss that night, no dramatic declaration, no crossing of lines that would have made this moment something other than what it was. Just 2 people who had spent most of their lives learning to want the right things, finally allowing themselves to exist in the space where those old certainties no longer applied. Before he left, I walked him to the door, and as he stepped into the hallway, I realized I was still wearing my wedding ring. I'd been meaning to take it off for weeks, but somehow never found the right moment, never felt ready to make that final symbolic gesture. Now, With Damien's footsteps echoing down the hallway and the apartment settling back into solitude around me, I slipped the ring from my finger and placed it gently in the ceramic dish I kept by the door. It made no sound as it settled there, just became another object among keys and coins and the ordinary debris of daily life. But something had shifted with that small action. Some invisible weight had been lifted. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be, living exactly the life I was meant to live, whatever that might turn out to be.